In the spring of 1945, as the guns of World War II finally fell silent across the battered continent, Europe resembled less a collection of nations and more a landscape of ruins. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Bridges and railways lay twisted and broken, factories stood gutted, and the countryside bore scars that would not heal for generations. The cost of victory was almost beyond comprehension. Some 60 million people were dead, with tens of millions more displaced, homeless, or separated from their families. Survivors faced a world of shortages and deprivation, where even basic food and shelter could not be taken for granted. Even in victory, the specter of suffering lingered, and across much of the continent, the fear of new dictatorships and the chaos of an uncertain future haunted daily life. Yet, amid this devastation, the political map of Europe was already beginning to redraw itself, not just with ink and treaties, but through the ambitions and anxieties of the new superpowers that had emerged from the war's crucible. The United States and the Soviet Union, each wielding unprecedented military and economic strength, now stood at the center of world affairs. The United States, far removed from the physical destruction that ravaged Europe and Asia, enjoyed the unique position of having its economy and infrastructure largely untouched. It possessed vast gold reserves and, crucially, the world's first nuclear arsenal. The Soviet Union, despite immense suffering and loss, had rebuilt itself into a formidable military and technological power, determined to shape Eastern Europe according to its own vision. At first, there were hopes that the wartime alliance, however uneasy, might become the foundation for lasting peace. Leaders met at Yalta in early 1945 seeking to chart a course for post-war Europe. They agreed on the division of Germany, Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, and the creation of a new international body, the United Nations. These decisions aimed to prevent further conflict, maintaining the fragile unity that had carried them through the war's darkest days. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The Western Allies, particularly the United States and Britain, grew wary as the Soviet Union moved swiftly to consolidate control across Eastern Europe. Stalin, haunted by memories of repeated invasions from the West, insisted on creating a buffer zone of friendly or subservient states. The West, meanwhile, viewed Soviet expansion with growing suspicion and alarm. Ideological differences, long suppressed for the sake of wartime necessity, now burst into the open. The incompatibility of capitalism and communism, rooted in the legacy of the Bolshevik Revolution and sharpened by the rivalry of the superpowers, became increasingly clear. The Soviet Union's imposition of Stalinist regimes throughout Eastern Europe, often by force or political pressure, provoked deep anxieties in Western capitals. The United States, fearful of further communist expansion, adopted the policy of containment, articulated in the Truman Doctrine, which promised support for nations threatened by Soviet influence. In these early years after the war, Europe's landscape divided along new fault lines. Germany, once the engine of conflict, was carved into occupation zones, and its capital, Berlin, became a focal point of Cold War rivalry. The Berlin blockade of 1948-49 crystallized the emerging divide. When Soviet authorities blocked all land access to West Berlin, the Western Allies responded with the Berlin Airlift, a massive operation to keep the city supplied by air. The standoff underscored a new reality. Europe was now a continent split not just by geography, but by ideology and power. This division became known as the Iron Curtain, a term popularized by Winston Churchill in a speech delivered in 1946. The Iron Curtain was both a physical and psychological boundary, separating the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc from the Western nations aligned with the United States. On one side stood NATO, formed in 1949 as a mutual defense alliance among Western democracies. In response, the Soviet Union and its allies established the Warsaw Pact in 1955, cementing the military and political division of the continent. Each bloc possessed formidable armies and, eventually, vast nuclear arsenals, locked in a balance of terror that would define the Cold War era. Yet even as Europe hardened into opposing camps, there were voices calling for a different future. The devastation of war had revealed the dangers of nationalism and division, and some leaders dreamed of a united Europe. Early efforts at cooperation, such as the European Coal and Steel Community, sought to bind former adversaries together through economic integration. These initiatives laid the groundwork for what would, in time, become the European Union. The early post-war period thus witnessed not only the seeds of division but also the first shoots of unity, as Europeans searched for ways to ensure that such catastrophe would never be repeated. The shadow that fell over Europe after World War II was long and cold. Hopes for enduring peace gave way to an era of suspicion, rivalry, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. The continent's wounds would take decades to heal, and the choices made in those first years after the war shaped not only Europe, but the entire world for generations to come. In the ashes of conflict, the division of Europe was both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder of how quickly alliances can dissolve and how the quest for security can so easily give rise to new and dangerous divides. As the 1940s drew to a close, Europe was no longer simply a continent recovering from war, but a chessboard on which two new superpowers maneuvered for dominance. The line that had begun as a metaphor in Churchill's famous warnings soon hardened into reality, an iron curtain, both political and physical, dividing peoples, cities, and destinies. This division did not happen overnight. It was forged step by step, shaped by decisions, confrontations, and calculated strategies on both sides. Central to this transformation was the Marshall Plan. Born from the conviction that economic chaos would breed extremism, the plan offered American aid to rebuild Western Europe's shattered economies. Billions of dollars flowed westward, not only to restore infrastructure and industry, but also to stabilize societies vulnerable to communist appeal. The Marshall Plan was more than a lifeline. It was a blueprint for democratic revival, requiring recipient nations to cooperate and enact reforms designed to foster free markets and political pluralism. While Western Europe seized the opportunity, the Soviet Union forbade Eastern Bloc countries from participating, viewing the plan as an intrusion into its sphere. This rejection marked one of the earliest and most decisive acts of division. The economic recovery that followed in the West stood in stark contrast to the centrally planned economies enforced in the East, deepening the rift in both prosperity and ideology. Alongside economic reconstruction came the consolidation of Soviet power in Eastern Europe. In capitals from Warsaw to Sofia, local communist parties, often backed by Soviet advisors, and the ever-present threat of the Red Army methodically eliminated opposition. Dissent was not tolerated. Non-communist parties were dissolved or co-opted, the press was censored, and secret police agencies multiplied. By the early 1950s, each country in the Soviet orbit had become an authoritarian state modeled on Stalin's Soviet Union, tightly controlled from Moscow. The process was not without resistance. There were strikes, protests, and even uprisings, but these were met with swift and often brutal repression. The result was an Eastern Europe almost hermetically sealed from Western influence, its societies reshaped to serve as both a buffer and an extension of Soviet power. Amid these mounting tensions, the military dimension of the divide took on a life of its own. In the spring of 1949, the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty marked another watershed. NATO was born, a mutual defense pact binding the United States, Canada, and most of Western Europe into a security alliance. The Treaty of Brussels had laid some groundwork, but NATO went further. Its members pledged that an attack against one would be considered an attack against all. The alliance was both a shield and a statement. The West would stand together against any aggression. The creation of NATO sent shockwaves through the Eastern Bloc, where Soviet leaders saw encirclement and threat rather than collective security. The Soviet response, however, was not immediate. For several years, Stalin relied on bilateral treaties and the presence of Soviet troops to maintain order in Eastern Europe. But as Western European integration accelerated and West Germany moved towards sovereignty and rearmament, the calculus changed. In 1955, the Warsaw Pact was established, a formal military alliance of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. This pact mirrored NATO's structure, binding its members to collective defense, but it also served as an instrument for the Soviet Union to tighten its grip on the region. Military command was centralized in Moscow, and the armies of Eastern Europe were reorganized to function as extensions of Soviet power. The formation of the Warsaw Pact brought the division of Europe into sharp relief, with two opposing blocs now arrayed against each other in a posture of permanent readiness. Berlin, divided and encircled, became the most vivid symbol of this new order. The city's unique status, deep within the Soviet zone but split between East and West, made it a constant flashpoint. The Berlin blockade had already demonstrated both sides' willingness to test each other's resolve, but it also revealed the limits of confrontation. The West chose the remarkable feat of the airlift over direct military engagement, while the Soviet Union ultimately lifted the blockade rather than risk open war. In the years that followed, the city remained a microcosm of the broader struggle, a place where the Iron Curtain was not just a figure of speech, but a daily reality enforced by barbed wire checkpoints and armed patrols. The opposing alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, were more than clusters of armies. They embodied contrasting visions for Europe's future. NATO's founding principles stressed democratic governance and voluntary cooperation, while the Warsaw Pact, though framed as an equal partnership, functioned as a mechanism for Soviet control. The military balance between these blocs became a subject of constant scrutiny and negotiation, with both sides amassing vast conventional forces and, eventually, nuclear arsenals. The standoff was not just about tanks and missiles, it was a contest of wills, institutions, and social systems. The division of Europe, once a matter of temporary occupation zones and provisional governments, had by the early 1950s become an entrenched reality. New institutions reflected and reinforced the split. In the West, organizations like the Council of Europe and, later, the European Economic Community arose in part as responses to the threat and challenge of the Eastern Bloc. In the East, the Soviet Union's consolidation of power left little room for independent initiative. The Iron Curtain, both visible and invisible, ran not only through cities and countryside, but through the hearts and minds of millions, shaping daily life, aspirations, and fears. Historians often debate the inevitability of this division, pointing to missed opportunities and the complex interplay of security, ideology, and ambition. But for those living through these years, the choices made by leaders in distant capitals cast long shadows over ordinary existence. Europe, which had once dreamed of unity in the aftermath of war, now found itself split along lines that appeared all but unbreakable. The world's most devastated continent had become the front line of a new, global struggle, a struggle defined as much by the walls built to keep people apart as by the alliances sworn to hold them together. To live on Europe's Cold War fault line was to inhabit a world divided not only by barbed wire and concrete, but also by the invisible boundaries of ideology, opportunity, and fear. In the shadow of the Iron Curtain, daily life diverged in profound ways, and nowhere was this more starkly visible than in Berlin, a city that became a living symbol of Europe's divided heart. For decades, the wall that split Berlin stood as both a physical and psychological barrier, separating families, friends, and entire ways of life. On one side, West Berlin bustled with the rhythms of a capitalist city, neon signs, department stores, and the hum of open debate. On the other, East Berlin was shaped by the routines of a planned economy and the ever-present watchfulness of the authorities. Though both sides shared the same winter winds and cityscape, the realities they faced were worlds apart. The contrast between East and West Berlin was not simply a matter of architecture or consumer goods, but of political freedom and personal autonomy. In the West, residents enjoyed a range of civil liberties and access to goods from around the globe, while in the East, shortages and censorship were facts of life. The wall, built in 1961, was highly effective at preventing escapes. Those who attempted to cross risked not only imprisonment but death, as border guards were under strict orders to use lethal force. The memory of those who died in the shadow of the wall is still honored today, a grim reminder of the costs exacted by division. Yet even within the Eastern Bloc, daily life was far from uniform. Each country behind the Iron Curtain adapted in its own way to the realities of Soviet rule. Some, like East Germany, maintained strict controls and a pervasive surveillance state. Others, such as Hungary and Czechoslovakia, experienced periodic eruptions of hope and dissent. In Hungary, the 1956 uprising was sparked by a mix of poverty, repression, and a yearning for reform. For a brief moment, it seemed the people might shake off the Soviet yoke. Students, workers, and ordinary citizens poured into the streets, demanding freedom of speech, the withdrawal of Soviet troops, and a multi-party system. The world watched as a new government, led by Imre Nagy, promised sweeping changes. But hope was short-lived. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, crushing the revolt with overwhelming force. Thousands died or fled the country, and Nagy himself was later executed. The brutality of the Soviet response sent a chilling message across the Eastern Bloc. Any move toward independence would be met with violence. Czechoslovakia's Prague Spring in 1968 followed a similar arc, though it unfolded with its own unique character. Under the leadership of Alexander Dubček, the country embarked on a bold experiment in socialism with a human face, introducing reforms aimed at liberalizing the press, loosening censorship, and granting citizens more political freedoms. For a few heady months, Czechoslovaks experienced a flowering of culture and public debate, openly discussing the future of their country. The atmosphere was jubilant, and the world's attention turned once again to the possibility of change behind the Iron Curtain. But the Soviet Union, determined to maintain its grip, orchestrated a Warsaw Pact invasion. Tanks and troops poured into Prague, and the dreams of reform were swept away almost overnight. The suppression of the Prague Spring served as a stark warning to others in the region. Moscow would not tolerate deviation from its model. These flashpoints were not isolated events, but symptoms of deeper tensions that ran through all aspects of life on both sides of the divide. In the East, economic systems were centrally planned, with production quotas and shortages shaping the rhythms of daily existence. Access to consumer goods was limited, and choices were often restricted to what the state provided. Some aspects of life in the East, such as gender parity in employment, were more advanced than in many Western countries, but discrimination and inequality persisted, and the transition after reunification brought new challenges, including persistent social divides and feelings of marginalization among former Easterners. Meanwhile, in the West, economic growth brought rising living standards and a sense of optimism about the future. Surveys taken decades after reunification reveal that many former West Germans continue to report higher life satisfaction than their Eastern counterparts, reflecting not only economic differences but also the lingering effects of decades of division. Despite efforts at reconciliation, attitudes toward the past and present remain shaped by the experiences of those years. The Cold War was also fought on the battlefield of culture. Both sides poured resources into propaganda, psychological campaigns, and cultural exchange programs, seeking to win hearts and minds. Western music, films, and literature filtered through the Iron Curtain, sometimes clandestinely, offering glimpses of a different world and fueling the imaginations of those starved for freedom. The Soviet Union responded with its own cultural initiatives, but over time, the appeal of Western popular culture proved difficult to contain. For many, these subtle influences, smuggled records, forbidden broadcasts, or the sight of Western fashion became acts of quiet resistance. Yet the tension was not solely abstract or ideological. The presence of armed troops and the constant threat of conflict weighed heavily on those living near the fault line. In Berlin, every checkpoint, every patrol, and every escape attempt underscored the fragility of peace. Diplomats navigated a labyrinth of rules and restrictions, always aware that a single miscalculation might spark a wider crisis. To live in divided Europe was to move through a landscape of contrasts between hope and resignation, conformity and dissent, plenty and want. The symbols of division, from the Berlin Wall to the memory of crushed uprisings, served as daily reminders that peace was uneasy, freedom conditional, and the future uncertain. Yet even in the darkest moments, the human longing for connection and change persisted, quietly undermining the walls that seemed so permanent. In the end, the realities of life on the fault line were as much about endurance and adaptation as about struggle and resistance, a testament to the resilience of those caught in history's crosswinds. By the dawn of the 1970s, after decades of confrontation and anxiety, the world seemed to draw a cautious breath. The superpowers, having tested each other's resolve time and again, now entered a new phase, a period of détente, as diplomats and leaders called it. Détente signaled a deliberate thaw in relations, a mutual recognition that endless brinkmanship brought only peril, not victory. This era was marked by careful gestures and negotiations, most notably a series of arms control agreements that sought, at last, to place limits on the spiraling nuclear arsenals haunting Europe's skies for a generation. Treaties like the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty emerged from marathon sessions between American and Soviet negotiators, each side weighing every word, every comma, with the utmost seriousness. For the first time, the two superpowers agreed to verifiable limits on certain categories of nuclear weapons, a tacit admission of the catastrophic risks lurking in their rivalry. Yet, détente was never just about missiles and warheads. Its true significance unfolded in the broader transformation of international relations, especially in Europe, where the Cold War's front line had always been most sharply drawn. The Helsinki Final Act, signed in 1975 by 35 nations from both blocs, was a milestone. In it, governments pledged to respect existing borders, promote economic cooperation, and, crucially, uphold human rights. Although the language was often vague, the act contained seeds of change. Eastern European dissidents and reformers would later use its commitments as a rallying cry to challenge the legitimacy of their own regimes. Throughout the 1970s, as official hostility eased, the flow of ideas and information across the Iron Curtain slowly increased. Western radio broadcasts, books, and even tourists became more common in the East, offering glimpses of alternative ways of living. Not all was harmonious. Détente had its limits and setbacks. Tensions flared and subsided, but the old, rigid certainty of perpetual Cold War began to dissolve. In the East, the Helsinki process emboldened citizens to demand more. If their governments had signed on to human rights, why not expect them to honor those promises? The seeds of transformation, sown quietly during these years, would bear unexpected fruit in the decade to come. In the 1980s, these undercurrents swelled into a tide. The Soviet Union, now under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, faced profound internal challenges: economic stagnation, mounting debt, and a growing sense among its citizens that the old certainties no longer held. Gorbachev responded with reforms known as perestroika and glasnost, aiming to restructure the economy and introduce a degree of openness into Soviet society. These policies, though initially cautious, had unforeseen consequences. They loosened the bonds that had held the Eastern Bloc together for so long, weakening the grip of hardliners and emboldening reform movements across the region. In Poland, the rise of the Solidarity movement, a trade union turned mass social force, challenged the communist monopoly on power and inspired others throughout Eastern Europe. Street protests, underground publications, and new political groups signaled a profound shift. In Hungary and Czechoslovakia, reformers pressed for dialogue, transparency, and change, encouraged by the sense that Moscow would no longer deploy tanks to quash dissent as it had in the past. The old machinery of repression no longer seemed invincible. What unfolded in 1989 remains one of the most dramatic chapters in modern European history. In country after country, communist regimes that had seemed unassailable for decades began to topple with startling speed. Peaceful demonstrations swelled in cities from Leipzig to Prague. In East Germany, mounting pressure from the streets, coupled with a wave of emigration through newly opened borders in neighboring Hungary, created a crisis the authorities could not control. Then, on a chilly November evening, a bureaucratic blunder at a press conference led to the sudden opening of the Berlin Wall. Crowds surged to the crossing points. Guards, confused and overwhelmed, opened the gates, and the wall that had divided a continent for a generation was breached by ordinary people determined to reclaim their freedom. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than a symbolic event. It was a catalyst that accelerated the collapse of communist rule across Eastern Europe. Within months, governments in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania either opened their systems to multi-party elections or fell entirely. The Soviet Union itself, racked by nationalist movements and political turmoil, unraveled in a matter of years. Its constituent republics declared independence, the Communist Party dissolved, and the old Union ceased to exist. An extraordinary, largely peaceful revolution that redrew the map of Europe. As borders opened and barriers fell, the dream of European reunification, long deferred, began to take shape. Germany reunified in 1990 as East Germany merged into the Federal Republic, setting a precedent for the integration of former communist countries into broader European institutions. Over time, nations that had once been part of the Warsaw Pact joined NATO and the European Union, forging a continent more united than at any point in recent memory. Yet the legacy of division did not vanish overnight. The scars of the Cold War economic disparities, social mistrust, and divergent moral landscapes continued to shape lives and politics across the continent. Still, the events of the late 20th century transformed Europe in ways that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years earlier. The collapse of the old order brought new freedoms, new challenges, and a renewed sense of possibility. The Cold War's end was not just a geopolitical shift, it was a profound moral and psychological reckoning, a recognition of the human yearning for dignity, self-determination, and connection. Even as some divisions linger in subtle forms, the story of Europe's thaw and transformation stands as a testament to the power of courage, vision, and the quiet persistence of hope.